Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. I'm Philip Chen, and I'm super excited for our second installment with Forrest Landry here today. I'm not sure if everybody was here last week, but we had a fantastic first session. And yeah, I hope to carry the momentum for the second session. It's gonna be a high bar for us to hit today. So for those who weren't here, I'll give a brief introduction on Forrest and as well as the protocol of how the session will work. So yeah, some of you may know Forrest as an entrepreneur who started Magic Flight, one of the first portable vaporizers in the world, but he's really known for a lot more. He's a philosopher, writer, researcher, engineer, craftsman, quite a bit. And I think he spends a lot of time now working on civilization design and really thinking long-term about the problems that facing humanity today. So I am personally grateful that there's someone like Forrest here in the world who can really put his intellect to some of these problems. And yeah, so that's a little bit about Forrest. I'm sure you'll get to know him a lot better over this session. So how today's gonna work is just a general open Q&A where Forrest will be answering some questions that you propose. So if you do have a question, please write it in the chat box and I'll call upon you to unmute and ask your question. This is recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, you can indicate in the question and I can just ask Forrest myself. Yeah, so that's the rules of engagement for today. For those of you who don't know, I believe there was a session this morning with Forrest, Evan, and Bonita, which was supposed to be Jordan's, where there was a lot of interesting things that were happening. So there might be some spillover as well. So that's just additional context for those of you who weren't in the morning meeting as well. But yeah, so wanted to get started. I am curious to try something where we all say hello to Forrest. And so I would love for people who want to, share your screen or share your video and then turn off of mute and say hi to Forrest for the next like 5 seconds. And shower him with love.
Hello.
Hi, Forrest.
Hi, Forrest. We love you.
Hello, Forrest. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you.
For you, Forrest.
All right. Yeah, we're experimenting here at the Stoa. I'm having some fun. So hopefully that gets our voices good for today. And yeah, so to start off, I hope there's some questions that we had from last session or you've been brainstorming some questions to ask over the past week. You can start putting them into the chat now. I will start with a question for Forrest. Yeah, is there anything on your mind or any specific topics that you may not have dove into last week that you wanted to discuss more today? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the session this morning was a little unexpected. Jordan was going to have his normal opening, and I had been invited to kind of tag along, and he didn't show. So the three of us, Evan and Benita and I, basically we had this wonderful conversation this morning, and a lot of the content there was about community and about the commons particularly. And I think we actually spent a lot more time talking about the commons. And so I'm feeling, questions in the space of communication and community, maybe a little bit more what I'm looking at. We also have a guest here, Alanya, who is new to this forum, I believe, and is a good friend of mine. And so I also want to call her out as essentially someone who's quite knowledgeable about many beautiful things. And so definitely welcoming for that as well.
Great. Alanya, do you want to unmute and say some thoughts and then potentially ask some questions or dialogue with Forrest?
You know, it's very easy with Forrest. Like, he can explain super intricate and very difficult things. I don't get half of it, but I can feel it. So when he is on his journey, I very often have something to just add from the little humble perspective from cold Norway. So I just want to be with you all and enjoy this ride with you. And if I have something to speak up, I will notice and I'll come in and see if that's possible to have some fun and to deepen the conversation that is here. Like, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, feel free to message me on the chat or jump in whenever you feel is good. All right.
Yeah. Can I just say something more?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Forrest came to my retreat, Avalon, and he said, like, you are up for a test. And then he drilled me for 5 hours, and I've never had more fun in my life. And so that's the beginning of our crazy friendship. So he's the smart one, and I'm the embodied one. And so feel free to just move into the galaxy with us. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, awesome. It sounds like it's going to be a fun session then. All right. So I see some questions coming in the chat. Yeah, Rob, why don't we start with you and unmute and ask your question.
Thanks. Forrest, I think you said last week something along the lines of if we keep seeing ourselves as the problem, then we continue to be the problem. But if we see ourselves as the solution to a deeper need, then there's a possibility of change, which I've been thinking about all week. And I'm really curious about this conception of ourselves as a solution to a deeper need. Could you say more what you feel about that deeper need and how we're a solution to it?
Beautiful. That's a very intimate question, but a delightful one. So if we think in terms of, say, the various functions that our body has, right? So we have a kind of immune system and we have a kind of nervous system. There's obviously a circulatory system and muscles, and there's like just all of these different things. And if we sort of scale up and we look at things on a more planetary level and a more geological time scale, you know, there's a sort of hypothesis that the ecosystem itself has a kind of organic being. It's called the Gaia hypothesis in some places. And so in that particular sense, if we are, you know, thinking of ourselves as a sort of citizen of the universe, then in the same sort of way, we need an immune system and we need a kind of nervous system. And so in effect, we could revision ourselves as the species that essentially fulfills some of the functions that are required to be stewards of that capability. So in effect, we can think of you know, our relationship to science and technology, our relationship to evolution, our relationship to you know, essentially the ecosystem itself, as essentially being more of an organic whole, and one where our consciousness is not just for our own sake, but is actually in service to these larger principles of life. And so, you know, in a sense, we all have this this sort of immediate feeling of well, that life is a gift, right? That there's a sense of gratitude that we have to for the brief time that we have on this earth to really appreciate that. And in reciprocity, we sometimes feel, if we're exploring this deeply, that there's a desire to connect to something larger, to connect to something deeper. You know, some people feel it as a religious impulse. Some people feel it as a sort of spiritual impulse. In many ways, there is a kind of deeper thankfulness for the gift of life. And so in this sense, I'm basically suggesting that if we're going to, you know, really follow that impulse and honor the life that we have, both in the experiential sense and also in the larger sense of connection to ecosystem, that we want to embrace that imaging that we have of ourselves as a kind of immune system and nervous system at a larger scale than just those which are particular to our own personal needs. So that's kind of the direction I'm hinting in. There's there's a lot more that can be gone into that, but this is altogether too early in the day to be trying to carry those kinds of energies. Melania's got her hands up.
Okay.
I think if you think about it like, what is the need? It's like, what is not only my need, but what has been my need? If you worked through your traumas, that is your gold. And I think if we look upon like, what is the world in need of? Like, what is it that this cosmos is asking for that you recognize and you see, and that you have a gift to fill? Then that is not only your need met, but also the world's need met. So by following what you cannot not do will give you a hint about what you can fill in the void of that human body and cosmos that we're in together. Like, what are you inspired to see that is uniquely yours?
Rob, you have any follow-up on that? You're on mute.
My keyboard wasn't working, sorry. I don't think I could even ask another question about that. You already went deeper than I even thought that question could go. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah.
I hate to say this, but I just touched the top 1% of what that depth is. So it goes a lot deeper than I can speak to right now. It's beyond my capacity at this moment, but yes, there's a lot more there.
Yes, there's a lot of depth in Forrest thinking for sure. I'd love to bring in, the morning session a little bit. So Evan, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. So my question was something that came up during that morning session that you spoke a bit on then, Forrest. So I'm curious about what your suggestions might be to this group for skillful ways to play with the somewhat porous boundary between the internal and external worlds. I feel like you were going some interesting places with that this morning, and I'm curious to hear further thoughts there. Thank you.
Wow, that is an open, a large field. So the Greeks particularly had this notion of know thyself. And in a way, I mean, we can treat that as a sort of entry point into this exploration. So on one hand, there's this sort of exercise of looking inwards, where we try to connect back to what is the origin of our choices, what is the origin of our needs, of our desires, of our wants. And in another aspect, it can be also treated as a kind of, how do we search for and discover and correct our blind spots? So there's a kind of willingness to try to see those things which are unseen, or those things which are essentially in places that are just out of the corner of our peripheral vision, that are still relevant and important for us to notice. And so in that sense, this exercise that is an ongoing one of attempting to develop clarity, to really create a kind of sense of deep come from within that is connected to a deep inwardness, and to clarify the channel through which that expression, that innermost quality of being, expresses. The clearer the channel, the clearer the process by which that touching of the deep subjective becomes enabled. There's a lot of really beautiful things that are enabled by that as a result. So in one sense, if we're looking at what sort of things are we trying to do, well, one of them is a sort of deep sense of connecting inwards. The next aspect which comes to mind as a deep practice is how we connect to the world. So in effect, craft, making things. I mentioned woodworking and blacksmithing and things like that as being crafts, but basically anything that you do that helps you to find really deep integration with the natural world. So that could be as simple as taking long walks out in the woods, or communing with a beautiful sunset, or being in the ocean. But in either case, what you're really trying to do is to get a deep sense as to what the reality of the world is, and to know it well, know the laws of physics if you must, or the skills required to to be an excellent person riding a bicycle, for example, you know, in some sort of profound way. So that would be kind of the second arena of action by which we would be wanting to deepen our connection. And then the third arena of action, which I'm sure all of us are already to some extent participating in, if we wouldn't be here in this call, is connection to other. And so in effect, you know, the nuances of communication process, the nuance of the social dynamics, how emotions work, how we respond to one another, the degrees to which we understand and can truly communicate. And I think that these three exercises, connection to self, connection to world, and connection to other, each have their own core nature, their own distinct aspects that evolve and emerge. And that when we balance our efforts in each of these, like we do each of them, like as if we're doing only and just that, right? If we're exploring towards knowledge of self, searching for our blind spots, it gets 100% of our attention. And if we're going to go into exploring the world, we give it 100% of our attention. We commit to the process of that exploration. And if we're going to be involved in relationship with other people, be really present in those relationships, be actually present. And so in this sense, there's a kind of balance that can be created in the dynamics of the relationships of these three, that if we were to just do one of them or even just two of them, that we would be missing the kind of health and stability needed to truly be able to create community and ecosystems that are actually going to thrive.
Evan, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I love that answer, first of all. Second of all, my follow-up to get a little deeper into the sense of the question is, in the Immanent Metaphysics, you say only when all three, technology, religion, and magic, are present in a significant degree is a new great work of art able to be created. And I'm curious if you could speak on the art of community as it relates to those three aspects.
That's a tricky question to answer. There's a lot that would need to be understood and assumed to really give this a proper response. When we think about the nature of how, yeah, that might be too advanced a question for me to answer. I have to set up.
Feel free to punt on it. No worries.
I might have to actually punt. There's a lot that needs to be understood to disentangle things. Like, for instance, the way in which religion holds a community together. And I don't mean religion in the usual way. I'm not talking about, say, Christianity or you know, any of the sort of formal ways of modeling, you know, narrative and stuff like that. I'm thinking more just in the sense of, how do we as groups of people accept other people into our group, or how do we accept each other into a group? Like, what is it that holds us together? What are the shared narratives or the shared values or the shared experiences that help us to relate to one another and have a common culture? So in that sense, I'm using the word religion in a very technical way. And the same is true for each of the three concepts that you just mentioned. So in a sense, there's sort of a background that's needed to sort of articulate why those specific things as expressive arts are involved. I should probably point out that there are some aspects of that book and that manuscript which were really intended to be understood in the context of a community or in a context of a larger practice that would have provided more context to be able to answer a question like this. So as I said, for some aspects of this, I think it's a little premature, so I have to punt.
Thanks, that was useful anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in, which is fantastic. I can remind everybody that feel free to +1 people, so that gives me a sense of what the room is feeling. Yeah. So for the next question, I would love to bring in Danny who had a question from last week, which I really wanted to ask, but didn't have time.
Hello there. I have been noticing, both in this community and other communities, there's some, it seems like it's emerging, this desire to fight in some ways, to get fighting skills, to hit that edge, and I'm not even quite sure because I don't generally feel it, but I know it really happens. And I think there's even been suggestion of a fight club, and there's like a glee that comes, like a sparkle that comes that, yes, let's do this. And I would just love it if you would talk about this a little bit. It's like I can't really quite feel all the threads involved in that.
Well, this is it's a good topic in a lot of ways. I mean, for instance, you know, in my perspective, there's a whole dynamics associated with emotions. So emotions have patterns. So for instance, if people are genuinely in anger, then underneath that is fear. And because that's the energy from which anger comes. And if we're going to figure out where the fear comes from, we're ultimately looking at what people care about. But you spoke specifically about the sort of glee aspect and the sense of what draws people into it. And I'm not talking, I mean, we could go down the direction of talking about individual traumas and how some people, you know, okay, that doesn't seem interesting to you. Great. So what I can do is I can certainly speak to the difference between, say, anger and passion. And I think that to some extent, this is a little bit closer to what your question feels to me to be about. The sense of glee and the sense of passion have a little bit of overlap. So for example, when we think about what distinguishes deep passion from anger, there's a kind of unconsciousness involved in anger that is present in passion. A person that's feeling passionate is very engaged. Their energy is flowing out. It's flowing from the solar plexus. They are deeply interested in involvement, right? So there's a strong outward flow of energy. And so in a sense, if it was an unconscious thing, that energy would be directed to try to get the world to do something, to create some sort of command and control, to sort of enforce an outcome. But if it's passion, it's usually a want to be with, like a deep desire to want to be with. And so in this particular sense, the thing that distinguishes them, like I said, is this idea that one can know what one cares about, right? So for instance, with anger, the person that's angry doesn't necessarily know what they're afraid of. But if you want to dig, that's what the question is. But if you are afraid and you know that you're afraid, then there's something that you care about. So ultimately, it's going to be sourced in the energy of love. Whereas a person is passionate is aware of what they care about. They're aware of what they love. And so their energy of engagement includes a much fuller and much richer emotional expression. So I think that in a lot of cases, people are, and this is maybe speculation on my part, but that people are wanting to engage. They want to actually have relationships that involve elements of passion rather than being driven just by wants or needs. And so in effect, there's this triple that has to do with desire, want, and need, right? Wants being satisfied externally, needs being satisfied internally, but passion being in the boundary between self and other. So in this particular sense, you know, when we live in a culture that has particularly been deeply isolated, deeply disengaged by COVID and by so many other things, that there is a desire to connect. There is a desire for people to feel that sort of deep engagement that on one hand involves a kind of a passion and a kind of skill. Think of the difference between, say, dancing and martial arts, right? If I am involved in just dance, I mean, people can see and know and can really tell who I am. But with a martial arts engagement, if there's a kind of sparring going on, then there's essentially a deep skill that goes in addition to the dance. It's like there's a being present in the moment and actually being fully and completely aware of all that is happening. And at the same time, being able to respond with all of oneself with complete commitment and engagement. And these flow states are naturally very desirable. People want to experience those kinds of things. So again, my hypothesis here is that in some cases, people are responding from, you know, a kind of fight trauma or a kind of, you know, situation where they're actually unconscious and are responding from fear. But others are basically saying, no, I just want engagement. I just want to feel that something is really happening and that sounds exciting. It sounds worthwhile in some sense. And that intuition is speaking up to, you know, wanting to create something where that engagement has a kind of higher calling. The actual movie that's associated with Fight Club has a number of somewhat sociopathic elements associated with it. And that can be something that can also be talked about and needs to be brought into consciousness. But I think that in a lot of cases, the element that you're speaking to and inquiring about can be found in the, as I said, the sort of intuitive sense of deeper connection being possible.
That was the key I was missing. That was the key I was missing. I really felt it. Go ahead, Alanya.
Yeah, I want to be a little bit blunt in my words. It's like it's the difference between self-leadership and self-leadership. So if you are angry and that comes from a reactive place and you bring your anger out of connection, it's actually dangerous. But if you am connected and you want to challenge and it's for something, then your anger can be the change maker of this world. But it needs to be in connection. And you need also to be willing to see how it lands in the person you're bringing the anger to. So it's very much getting out of the drama and into the dharma. Like if we can act from also, I like your word passion, but I would also like to add in compassion. Can I bring my anger from my solar plexus up through my heart and be a warrior with a clean sword? Like if my sword is clean, it wouldn't hurt, it would open. If my sword is blunt, it creates victims. So for a forum like this, for you as a group, like to be with each other and celebrate self-leadership and really call out self-leadership. Like if you see someone out of connection bringing their anger, well, then we have the whole thing that Forrest pointed to, then it's the trauma operating underneath it. But if you have worked through your trauma and you find yourself power, that you can discern that something is of unjust, then be the challenger of that. But make sure it's for and that you stay in connection.
So I just have one reflection. I also love the dance. It's like that dance and martial arts. And what I can feel is some of the glee is the actual play. Yeah. The play that can happen, you know, with animals, they play at fighting. Yeah. And so I'm landing in that because that has the passion in it. Yeah. It's passion it's playing with passion almost. Yeah, lovely.
That's right.
Thank you both.
Yeah, I would love to move from anger to nostalgia. I have a question from Mia that I will read. What is the role of the sense of personal or generational nostalgia play in energizing new and different meaning in building community and society?
That's a question I've not heard before. In reflection on my own life, where nostalgia has been particularly strong, there's a sense of, first of all, just reaffirmation of the value of the experience that I'm being nostalgic for. And in the experience of that value, the deeply held sense of, wow, I would love to experience that again. I would love to return to the sense of the feeling of that moment. That there is a sort of guidepost. I mean, it's like looking back at our past relationships with earlier lovers and basically saying, what did I learn? What does that help me to be more discerning about the choices that I make from here and what I truly value going forward? And so in that particular sense, I think that although we can't necessarily expect to be able to recreate the form in which those feelings were created once, that if we hold the feeling of that well, that we can find new forms in which it can manifest.
Thank you, Forrest. Thank you.
All right. Ryan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, that just hit me real hard. That was really well said. Thank you, Forrest, for that. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of intimate and anonymous knowledge, or ways of knowing, or maybe I'll just talk about it like I said in the question this morning. You brought up the idea that the essence of the notion of the commons is that which is most intimate to life. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about intimacy of the commons, and perhaps commoning as a shared public act of intimacy. This kind of talks a little bit to what you were speaking about with Evan's question, or a public knowledge of what is essential to life. And then also curious about the opposite of, like, maybe 200 years ago or 100 years ago or 50 years ago, I wouldn't have the information capacity or knowledge system to know that the Amazon was in fact really important right now to my respiration, to this exact breath I'm taking. So somehow this really anonymous, otherwise anonymous knowledge becomes in fact very intimate to me and becomes part of my commons. Yet it's still very different because I don't live in the Amazon. I haven't spent time in the Amazon. It's also, there is an anonymous quality to it. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that interplay of intimacy versus anonymity as our information and capacity for knowledge increases. And also maybe this talks a little bit to what Alanya was saying earlier. I can feel great overwhelm when that knowledge expands beyond my actual capacity for action. And so as I hear stories of the Amazon burning, and I don't have in effect a way to make change in that space, I become overwhelmed with my knowledge of the commons and the relationship to my agency and choice. So I know that was a lot, but thanks for bearing with me.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's actually a lot of questions. There's several in there that I recognize, all of which are relevant. So I'm probably gonna need to go slowly, and this will take some time. When I was speaking of the commons as being intimate to life, I was bundling in a whole lot of information in saying that, and some of which is not necessarily obvious. What is one level of that, as you mentioned, is the kind of notion of an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is obviously larger than any one of us and has no real ego of its own. So, for instance, we can think of the individual member of a species, and then we can think of the species as a kind of organism, and then we can think of the ecosystem as a collection of all the organisms working together. And that would be, again, I know this sounds somewhat mechanical the way I'm describing it, but the notion of individuality applies in just one of these places. In fact, there's a kind of axiom 3 statement that shows up here, which is a little bit like, for every way in which something is bound by ego, there are 2 ways in which it is egoless. For every way in which something is self, there are 2 ways that it is not self. And we've already encountered that concept a few times. It turns out the reverse is also true. Just for completeness sake, I'll also state, for every way in which something is not self, there's 2 ways in which it is. So those are technicalities. They're not necessarily relevant right now. But what I can say, though, is that when we're thinking about community and the digital commons in particular, because I think that's sort of the thrust of the question. You're trying to go back into how do we take some of these ideas into practice in this context? How do I relate to them in an immediate way? Does that feel alive, or am I going a little off track? Okay. So one sense is that when we think about our communication, when we think about the engagement of communication, we can see these two elements. One of them is that I can only speak as myself. I can only participate as my being in this moment, right? I'm the here and now. And in one sense, that goes into a larger process, i.e. our dialogue, the dialogue that is the communication that we have with the world, with other people, and so on. And in that sense, it goes beyond myself. It becomes impersonal in the transition from my speaking to our conversation, right? So this is like the first step by which it becomes part of the ecosystem, part of the culture, part of the commons. So the experiences that everybody has here, for example, becomes part of the narrative on the stories that we tell from this moment on for what things we find meaningful and have discovered to be worthwhile. And in that sense, it becomes not about self anymore. It becomes our stories rather than just my speaking. So in this particular sense, there is a sort of motion away from the egoic. And I think that to really articulate that well, we want to sort of recognize that the ways in which those expressions show up after the speaking, the way in which those narratives are taken and propagated into other conversations and so on and so forth, that there's a kind of fabric of connectivity that is created around that. And that fabric of connectivity is the very context by which we even understand the world around us, right? The stories that we tell each other and the ways in which we do sense making together is in the communication process. None of us makes sense of anything by ourselves. We talk to our friends, we talk to our families, we talk to our coworkers. We're constantly engaged in this give and take in communication so that we receive from those common context conversations the perspectives about what matters, what's meaningful, what is alive, and it meets something within us that effectively becomes the basis of our own expression. And so the cycle continues. I think returning to another aspect of your question, this process of this cycle, this sort of flow that goes from personal to impersonal and then transforms and then comes back into personal again. There's a sense in which the aliveness of a community is in that flow, in that breath. And that in effect, that which doesn't support life will not continue to live. So we have to be present. We have to show up. We actually have to be engaged. Because without that engagement, the creativity that brings us into the moment to even have the will to make the choice, it doesn't go. It doesn't happen. So in effect, there's a need for us to recognize that sense of playfulness with which we have conversations is not just something that creates the capacity for other people to have narrative, but is literally in the creativeness of it itself is the basis by which our lives come to life. So these describe, at least just in this moment, some of the dynamics of how some of these pieces fit together. How do we hold that? You spoke quite eloquently, I felt, that, with the Amazon in particular, because this also is very dear to my heart. The sense that there is such a great valuing, there's such a great desire to really be able to hold sacred things in a sacred way. And to really, this actually connects back to the question of nostalgia a bit, to really bring that valuing into the conversation with the people that you're with in this moment. There's a piece of music, I think it was from the 60s. If you can't be with the one that you love the one you're with. If I can't have the experiences that I want to, I have to enjoy the experience I'm actually having. And so in effect, there's a sense here that although I can't necessarily do something about grand project X and Y the way I would want to, or the way I believe that I should, if I wish to should on myself, which I wouldn't recommend, but nonetheless, that there's a sense here by which we engage more fully in appreciating the life that we have where we are standing. That we bring into that moment the fullness of the passion that is held for the greater causes, not to try to convince anyone else to do anything, but to engage them in that reflective inquiry of what can we do to speak of these things, to fulfill the deep sense of feeling of the value of that, and how can we bring that alive in this moment in a way that is actually reciprocal. And surprisingly enough, with practices like that engaged as deeply as we could think of them to be, the change does happen. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Awesome. Yeah, gonna slow down a little now. Remind that we're halfway through the session. This is a 90-minute session with Forrest. And I see, Claudia, you might want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to check with Forrest. Would you like me to bring in something of the different levels of surrender?
I hadn't thought of it. It's probably okay. I think that there'll be a context that'll actually, that part will fit more deeply.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
I appreciate the offer, though. I'm recovered, so I'm all right. Thank you.
I want to jump in with a question where you talked about play a couple of times today, and specifically in conversation. Like, can you talk about like why is it important and just that general concept?
Definitely a great question. I'm so glad you asked that. I would truly love to give some voice to this concept. So this is actually one of the easiest ones. The difference between work and play is whether or not there is contingency that other people are depending on. And this sounds obscure, but it's actually quite basic. If I am doing work, it basically means that someone else is depending upon what I do, right? If I'm in a factory and I'm making widgets, the step that I perform is the step that is needed so that the next person can do the part that they're going to do. Whereas if it's play, you don't want those kinds of contingencies. You don't want the imaginary thing that you're doing to be consequential, because then you wouldn't feel safe to actually be engaged in doing those things, because again, it would be consequential. You know, people could get hurt or stuff would change that you didn't want to. Really, you know, you want to be able to explore and to experiment and to try things out and to see what happens, and then kind of erase the chalkboard and draw something else. So in effect, there's a sense here in which, in order for us to do sense making, in order for us to essentially engage with the world, sometimes, particularly when we don't know what's going on and we're trying to figure it out, we want to try out a whole bunch of different hypotheses, see what works, what sticks, what doesn't, what feels alive, what doesn't. So in effect, there's a sense by which we're engaged in this sort of exploration as a kind of limbering up exercise by which we can truly discern what's actually happening. You know, one of the so we mentioned this group that called Avalon, that Alanya is she brings this to the world. And so in effect, there's a sense here where we listen and observe how the play actually unfolds. We watch how people move. We notice what they say and what expressions they did, and through that we can essentially perceive and discern more deeply what might actually be going on. And so in effect, there's this sort of to use the word playful exploration, that it's not the case that we can even do exploration without there being some sense of not knowing, right? Some comfort with the ambiguity, and the willingness to sort of engage with the ambiguity, to engage with the unknown, and to some extent the unknowable. When we're working on stuff, we want to know the outcome because it takes effort to make things happen. And so in effect, you want to be efficient and stuff like that. But many times, if we if we look at the world as it is today, there's so much extraction going on. There's so much situation where people are essentially making it all about work, all about consequence. You know, how can I make money move around faster so that I can extract enough so that I can essentially live? These are all, some of these are very artificial problems. And in a sense, there's this focus that play is something that children do and work is something that adults do. But if you notice, they're not letting the children play and they're not letting the adults work. And it's just like, wait a minute. We need to go back to basic principles and really understand what's going on. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which things get really confused. You know, look, see, and tell the truth. Just stop and pay attention. And if part of that paying attention happens to be how do we engage playfully in this moment so that we can make better sense as to what's going on, then that's what I'm going to advocate for. So here we are.
Awesome. Drew, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Forrest. My question is about dynamics work. We have a lot of efforts on how to bring people together. I noticed that a lot of times for me, what's most helpful actually is focusing on the space in between. So like when in friendships or with groups, like the space in between when we meet together, that actually is, I don't know, like I haven't seen that talked about a lot. And then sometimes it's even to the extent like being okay with the group dissolving completely allows for it to continue. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or had put some theoretical language around anything related to that.
Oh, for sure. First of all, I affirm completely what you're saying. And the idea here is that, you know, if you're asking for what are some of the formalities associated with that. So one of them is, you know, can you be with yourself? Do you like the company that you keep? And in sense of being able to truly be, then I can be with. So, you know, as we were speaking earlier on this, this notion of, you know, exercises that was, you know, one of them was know thyself. Then I can know the world, and then I can know other. A lot of people want to skip ahead. They want to go directly to know other, and they haven't found themselves yet. They don't know who they are. What is the company that they keep when they are alone? And so in effect, if I'm going to be deep in self-knowledge, I want to sometimes experience a lot of different things, but also experience some remoteness in order to be able to have my come from place be truly grounded. You spoke of another aspect too, which actually felt quite relevant to me, which was this notion of being okay that sometimes the group dissolves in order that it can come together again. Life has this cycle. Our cells, our body is like a colony of cells. It's a perennial truth for pretty much all of us that that colony is going to dissolve. It's going to come apart. You know, we have a name for this. And so in effect, there's a dynamic here where that enables the capacity for new life to come into being. The same's true for groups. I've watched communities form. I've watched them go. I've noticed the life cycle that they have, and there's an appreciation for that. You know, there's obviously nostalgia for some particularly wonderful groups, but at the same time, I have some confidence that humanity will endure. And so in effect, there's a sense here by which we want to become more nuanced as to how we think about these engagements, more wise in our relationships. Right now, there's a lot of people who are, you know, so hungry for relationship, have been alone for so long that they're reaching deeply, and they're not necessarily even knowing how to do that. Right? We haven't been in tribal relationship for a really long time. Right? It's been a few thousand years. And so many of those skills are just simply absent. And so in effect, when we're looking at how do we come together in community and how do we do so in a way that is not going to be subject to the predations of people that aren't necessarily as as adept at figuring out how to be in relationship. You know, there's some actual skillfulness that's needed to navigate that. And sometimes that skillfulness is contingent upon our being able to step back and really feel out what's going on, to really look at the situation and to essentially compare notes slowly with other people, and from there build up a position for how to be in connection to the group again. These are all different ways that are connected to some of the things that I believe that you're feeling through.
Any follow-ups, Drew?
Yeah, what's coming to mind is earlier we were talking about the energy coming from the solar plexus, and I've done some exploring with different types of energy work, and it's interesting because the experience of like working with like the energies of my body is so much different than coming here to the stoa and talking about it. And I was wondering, I just kind of feel a connection between that like felt sense of where that energy comes from in my body, and then how you're describing being able to step back to know how to engage again. Is that something that you've experienced as well? Is that I guess I'm just kind of noticing that the talking about it versus the feeling it is just so different.
Agreed. Yeah, just agreed. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, Lonnie, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm also sensing into like there are different frequencies in solar plexus and the heart frequencies, and these are things that are changing as you are developing. And I think one of the most beautiful things we can do as we are in development of ourselves is to really stay curious. And when you said like in the space in between, I really often need to remind myself and others like to just stay in curiosity. And so one of the things that I live by is like, I don't move if I'm not touched, but if I am touched, I do move. Because it does something to me energetically to get closer to something, to come closer to another person, for instance. And so by this, what I'm sensing with your body is like your system is coming so aware and so finely raffinated. So the only way to live with that is to learn how to move into connection with it. I just heard that longing, and I think I get where you're at.
Yeah, thank you. That I didn't know that came through, but that's very accurate.
Yes, I've definitely been touched many times throughout these sessions. We'll continue one more of these. So I'd love to bring Rob back for your follow-up. Let's see where this can go.
Yeah, this is on the topic that we're touching on currently. Forrest, you mentioned last week that you think a lot about community, and especially how community goes wrong. And I wanted to pry under that a bit and ask you why community goes wrong. I don't imagine it to be a single answer, but I wonder if there's an area you'd like to explore under that question with the reason community goes wrong.
Well, actually, this is a brilliant, beautiful thing you've asked. There's a book called Living Together, and it's actually one of the primary sources for this sort of work. It explores how to form communities, how to form intentional communities, and it talks about things like, you know, land ownership and how to deal with building codes and all that kind of stuff. But it also looks at very much the ways in which communities struggle, like what happens, like what are the kinds of dynamics that create that. Another place that has been very informative towards this topic is the Tamara Community in Portugal. And they formed onto the premise, you know, that actually it's hard to do community. There's, you know, if you think that doing a startup, like let's say you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to start a new business, you look at statistics for something like that, and it's a little sobering. You know, you basically see 100 companies start out, but by the end of the first year, only 20 are left. And by year 5, only 5 are left. And so in effect, the attrition rate can be quite high. The other thing though is that a community is actually harder than a business. Because with a business, all you got to do is essentially figure out product market fit. Now that's not trivial, by the way, but it at least is a discrete task in a fundamental sort of sense. Whereas figuring out human social relationships is an order of magnitude more complicated than that, because it's not just going to be, can we make money together, but can we live together? It's a whole other order. So naturally, the notion of just the sheer complexity of biology and of life and of just the variations that we all have, you know, we're all very kind of unique people. So there's some specific sets of challenges that tend to emerge out of that, having to do with power dynamics, with money, with sexuality, and with things like that. And one of the things the Tamara community did, and it was actually Daniel Schmachtenberger that brought this to my attention, was that in effect, if you solve the problems, like, so essentially the Tamara community basically said, if we can figure out a way to solve these most difficult problems, then all of the things that are essentially easier than that will be easier to do. So in effect, in the context of solving these kinds of problems, we can put together communities that have intentionality in other ways. So they made their intentionality to figure out how to do the hard things. And they're still around more than 30 years later now. And so they have, in a sense, learned some things about that. I won't try to repeat all that they've learned here, but there's some definitely very good social techniques that they've developed. I'm thinking particularly of the forum practice. In another sense, to connect this back to the Living Together book, so I spent some time, a few days at least, you know, really studying what the research was associated with that and with other things, and put together a whole list of questions that would be, you know, the kinds of things that if a community was to form, that these would be the kind of things that they would want to ask themselves, you know, to get into a dialogue and just basically say, hey, if X came up, how would we handle this? And to just see how easy it is for that conversation to even happen. Are there dynamics that emerge in the conversational process that basically indicate that there are value differences that nobody would have noticed unless that question had been asked? So in this particular sense, it's not so much a question of, you know, what can go wrong. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but what is our process for being able to identify how to make it more easily and more likely the case that things will go right? So in effect, this list of questions, and there's about 300 of them, it's quite extensive, is just a tool that basically allows a group of people to basically explore the dynamic of how to live together and to essentially develop a kind of Aikido practice around that. So in a sense, the capacity to live together, I guess I can come back to another notion, which is, you know, more in a relational sense. You know, one piece of advice that I received when I was quite young, and I was very fortunate to receive this, you know, when asking, you know, how do you choose a partner? And part of it is, well, just find someone you can talk to. The rest is gravy. It's actually not easy to find someone that you can really talk to, that you like can just completely open up to and say anything and know that that's going to be a conversation rather than a judgment. And so in a sense, there's a degree here too, where we're looking for, can the community talk? Can they have a conversation even about the difficult topics? Can they find resolution? Do they have it within themselves to move beyond just personal needs and to be able to actually look at things from multiple perspectives and to really do the work to find what is the resolution that's going to be the one that works for the health of that place? So those are the kinds of things that I think are actually really perennial questions and perennial conversations. It obviously takes a lot of work. We have, you know, not that I'm claiming that I have any great skills in this space, but I can at least observe that insofar as we're looking to have it more likely that the right thing happens, the skillfulness of being able to have these conversations means it's more likely that the right thing happens. So that's what I would point to.
I would jump in here, and there's quite a few people in the chat wondering the book Living Together, which one are you referring to?
Well, I can probably find it on my shelf in about 30 seconds, but I'm a little hesitant to just get up and find it. I don't remember the exact author's name. It's the one I have is a paperback. It has, can I maybe respond
Yeah.
after the session? That would probably be the easier way.
Sure. And yeah, Rob, did you have any follow-up? No. Okay, great. Yeah, while we're on this topic, Elliot, did you want to unmute and ask your question from very early on?
Thanks, Phil. Forrest, thank you for this and all the sessions. One of the topics is civilization design, and I'm curious if you can point us to either civilization designers or civilization designs that are out there that really speak to you or you think are kind of on the cutting edge of thought development.
Well, this question's a little tricky. First of all, I should probably point out that at the moment, to even suggest that anybody is doing civilization design is a little bit of hubris. Actually, it's a lot of hubris. So let me first clarify that point, because that's kind of important. I don't know that anybody in the world can actually design civilization. That's just, not a thing. But what we can do is we can create the kinds of context in which the sort of process by which we collectively can design civilization. So in effect, if we're looking at, how do we come together as community, or how do we create civilization, or so on and so forth, we can become more conscious of what these things are. So when I think of civilization, I notice that part of it is this notion of city, and part of it is this notion of civility. And if I'm going to hold both those notions well, I actually need to know a lot of things about what makes a city healthy, which means I'm now starting to think about things like ecosystem balance, energy balance, and social balance. If I'm thinking about civility, then I'm thinking a lot about what we would normally think of as communication practices, how a kind of general awareness to solve problems emerges, and what is design thinking and stuff like that. So, in one sense, we can sort of start to get a sense as to what are the essential questions that we would need to be able to think about and to ask, and not necessarily to answer, but at least be able to have good, strong directions towards being able to answer. So in effect, right now, it's a little hard to point to models of civilization, because quite frankly, there is one model and it spans the earth. Since about the 80s or so, there's really been essentially one uniform economy, and it's got obviously lots of corners and edges and things like that, but there aren't really exactly examples to point to, because there's just the one at this point. Now, I could go back in history and I could try to point to things that were long ago and far away, but it would actually be quite difficult to get enough information about those to use it as a good example. And trying to point to things that are smaller than that, like I could certainly suggest things like, for wanting to understand how to do governance well, there are some good examples. Like, it's interesting. I traveled to Switzerland about this time last year, and I was just super impressed as to how well they're organized. I mean, those people have their act together. They really do. Coming back to the United States after having explored that a little bit, I was feeling a little embarrassed. I mean, I flew back to San Francisco, which at one point, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, think Star Trek and stuff like that, was kind of modeled as the future of what we want humanity to be like and civilization to be like in the future. And it's far from that now. And so in a sense, there's this reluctance on my part to point to very much as far as examples are concerned, simply because there's so much entanglement, and the examples that I would give would effectively end up being political. So in that particular sense, I feel more often the desire to go back to sort of really core ideas, which is why I talk about things like civility and cities, and how do we stabilize the three balances necessary to make a city something that endures without damaging the world that it's in. I mean, there's a book floating around called Sand Talk, for example, and it basically rejects the idea that there's any possibility that there could be a stable city. Obviously, technology implies certain implications, and that's not going away. So there's a sense here in which we really need to figure out new answers. We have to actually solve the problems that we're faced with. And so to some extent, it isn't so much about civilization design to the sense of trying to create something which is better than what we've got currently, so much as we need to create something that actually works at all. The current model is unstable in certain particular ways, and those issues will show up. And so in effect, it's important for us to basically be using the capacities and resources we have presently to create the kinds of capacities and resources necessary to solve these sorts of problems, and then to actually do so. And this isn't something that any single person is going to do. It's going to be something that maybe through clear thinking and practices that enable us to move from disharmony to literally being able to have the conversations that are needed. And to some extent, that's a lot of what my personal efforts have been focused towards.
Thank you. That's good to hear from someone who's one of the leading thinkers in the space, because you hear the term thrown around and it's such an inspiring term, civilization design, but it's like, where are these, right? And then just a quick follow-up, where do you find the best space? I mean, maybe the STOA, but the best space for these kinds of conversations to be had, at least in the frame, even kind of humbly acknowledging it might not be possible. Where are the civilization design-esque conversations being held, or best possibly held?
You've hit a nerve, man. I got to say, this is an area where I'm personally experiencing pain right now. That term, civilization design, as you've mentioned, has been bandied about an awful lot, and I have come to regret to see that happen. Places where these conversations are happening, there's a lot of signaling that there's conversations in this space. I personally haven't experienced very many what I would consider to be genuine conversations in this space, and I'm very discouraged to be able to say that. I'm not trying to say that such things aren't happening or can't happen, but on the other hand, I have far too frequently seen the firsthand experience of that in my life. So I guess you could say that I hold strongly the hope for more of those kinds of conversations to actually happen, and to do so in a way that isn't bound in terms of political agendas or some sort of presentation mode which is designed to impress in one fashion or another. There's a sacredness that's involved in this, and we can't have it be personal in that sense. And so each time I see it happening in a way that is connected to some business or some Bitcoin thing or so many agendas, I cringe. Each time I cringe. So I have to admit that to some extent, I have become increasingly reluctant to even enter into conversations about that topic. I am feeling more comfortable here with the STOA because it is a small group. People are coming with genuine curiosity and fewer agendas, and at least so far as I've seen in the brief time that I've experienced it, some real compassion. And I'm definitely feeling that that's more the orientation that is needed for us to genuinely engage with topics of this nature.
I'm appreciating the humility here. Avalon, yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think I want to add, because there is, when I run retreats and there are many people with concepts and ideas, and they will come like, look at my project, like, look at this, like, and they're all making construct of something, like, so everything will be in line with Mother Nature and everything will be done like this, and we will communicate so, and this and that and that. And I will just be like, I think a graduate teacher that receives a beautiful drawing and says like, well, this is beautiful, let's put it on the wall with all the others that are painting and making structures and designing and whatever. But my question would be, who is at home? Who's there?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly right.
Thank you both. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, that was great. Really reframed some of the conversation. Yeah, I'd love to shift gears and have Jason, you unmute and ask your question.
Hey, yes. Forrest, thank you so much for being here. As everyone else said, we're so grateful. I have to scroll up a little bit to remember what I said. It was, oh yeah. So you spoke last week about meaning being inherent in aliveness, which is a quote that I wrote it down and it stuck with me all week. When I think about meaning, I always associate it with having a story. I was wondering, and then I always think about like, well, we have so many problems. We're kind of have this like ecocidal trajectory because we don't have this cohesive story that we can all kind of like connect to. And I'm wondering kind of, I'm not even sure if that's like a place that I should be going now. I'm sort of questioning that. But then I'm wondering like, if that is true, how do we support the emergence of this story?
I like this question. I've actually been liking all the questions. I'm delighted to hear this. I am at this particular point probably the maximum heretic. So I hold the position, or I'm basically advancing the idea of a position, which is one that leadership and narrative is not the way. Now, some stipulations. First of all, we cannot think without thinking in narrative. Our consciousness works in narrative. It's just inherent in the way our brains and our consciousness and our perception, it's like narrative is going to be part of the process. But when I hear the notion that we don't get along because we don't have a common narrative, I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, this sounds a little bit like some sort of mechanism of social control. And as soon as you try to create some sort of social control, you know, you've got some sort of causal feedback mechanism, and somewhere or another, someone's going to figure out how to leverage that to their personal benefit. Now you have a private commons problem. So the notion of community as to some extent a distributed phenomena, the notion of choice making as to a large extent a distributed phenomena, the notion of creation as a distributed phenomena, that all of these things don't have a source in the sense that they come from one person in particular or even one story in particular. I can talk about creation as if it was a narrative of how things came to be, but I'm actually more interested in how the narrative came to be. And so in effect, there's a realization here that although we interact with narratives and so on and so forth, it is not the basis by which we come together. It's a way in which we can, but it isn't ultimately the nature of the being together that is held in this abstract notion of narrative. It's in the actual sense of really being together, right? If I reach out and I hold your hand, there's the fact of my holding your hand, independent of the story I have about it. And so in effect, there's the stories that we can have to signal that we belong to community, and then there's the actual being with other people in community. And so to some extent, I think that when I hear people basically saying, hey, we need more leadership, or we need to create a grand narrative, or things like that, I kind of back up a little bit and I basically say, you know, these are the kinds of tools that people who are, well, think of children, for example. Children want to be given sort of a firm thing to respond to. They kind of want to know, how do I understand the world? What do I need to relate to this? And so there's a kind of stage at which stories and narratives and things like that are actually really, really appropriate. But humanity is dealing with forces that call us to be able to be mature and responsible beyond that level. Technology is on one hand this this powerful plaything, but in another sense, it's not a toy. And so we have some responsibilities. We need to rise to a higher level of maturity as a species in order to be able to even receive the gifts that have been given to us. So in that sense, I'm simply suggesting that as long as we fixate and hold on to the notion of narrative and leadership as being the way in which things are going to happen and the way in which things are going to change, the water will continue to slip through our fingers because we're grasping too tight. So I don't spend a lot of time coming up with stories. I don't spend a lot of time coming up with metaphors or with symbols or with pretty pictures of what the future would look like in the sense of vision. I do think about these things, but I don't necessarily express that way very often, and there's a reason. All of this is just a hint, but it gives you a sense of the direction in which I feel is the one that has been at this moment the most fruitful in my explorations.
Jason, I see you smiling. You got a follow-up?
No, I really appreciate that answer. And a lot of people are bringing up art as a way of kind of like relating what I'm going with. And I think that that feels really relevant to me. Thank you, Forrest.
Glad to help.
Yes, I have been seeing a lot of art in the chat. Love to bring in Matt to ask you a question about this.
Sorry, just getting set up here. Can you hear me? All right, cool. Yeah, so definitely art as a focus. Just curious about your views of the role of the artist in kind of bringing about some of these things, especially with what we were just talking about with narratives, and kind of maybe using narrative to deconstruct narrative was a thought that I was thinking there, you know. Anyways, yeah, I won't go too much more into it. There's so many thoughts that come up there, but yeah, just kind of thoughts about how an artist should be contemplating these things and bringing them without, you know, being too specific or, you know, getting too deep. And, you know, in our current culture, it seems very easy to be misinterpreted. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
I do see a relationship between art and culture. I think that, you know, when I sort of look at where are those places in a city, for example, that feel most alive, it's usually on those margins where the rent's a little less and there's not quite so many rules, and some people gather and they start doing art together, and that becomes the vibrant center at which new commercialization tends to sort of focus. So there's clear evidence that that artistic communities are the way in which aliveness comes into a place. There's a couple of factors that I think are kind of important to keep in mind. One is that art is tremendously individual, right? There's a sense in which I bring myself into my art, and so when we look at the dynamic of artistic expression and so on and so forth, it's kind of easy for art to become about ego and to become about a person's, quite frankly, sexual expression, and you know, that signaling that happens as a result. Is so there's a thing here where we're basically saying that we want to find the right balance between good choice making at a community level and the sort of expressive capacities that individuals have to contribute to culture. And there's some nuances to that, because again, you know, on one hand, we're talking about a cultural commons, and on the other hand, we're talking about individual artistic expressions. And so that it's the intersection between those two things, which is the dynamic, which is, I think, probably the one that's needing to most be held well. I think at this particular moment, without trying to spend a lot of time developing a sort of apparatus with which to think about how to hold something like that well, I think I'll just leave it at that for now. But I really see that in the same sort of way that, sustainability is important and evolution is important, that consciousness is important, that conscientiousness is important. And that without holding all three of these in balance, that things will go out of whack, right? If you have just sustainability without evolution, well, you end up with a pretty static world and nobody wants to live there. If you have just evolution without sustainability, well, it doesn't really have a future. And if you don't have conscientiousness, if you don't have the right sort of consciousness, you can't balance the dynamic of sustainability and the dynamic of evolution. So in this particular way, there's a sort of dynamic livingness between phenomena that comes out of a sort of evolutionary perspective, of which I'm speaking specifically of art, and phenomena that comes out of a survival perspective, which has to do with, basic needs, things like food and shelter and clean water and medicine and communication. And clean air, I should mention that too. So in this sense, there's a there is a kind of interplay where there are things that we need to do that are, necessary to take care of the real needs of the world. And then there are other pieces of it where we want to play together, where we want to have the sort of freedom to be engaged in the deeply intimate and personal ways in which, humanity is expressed. So I think that that's at least giving some context that articulates some of the aspects of the question that you're asking, without having actually answered all of it either, by the way.
I'm wondering if Matt wants to have a follow-up on it, to probe more deeper.
No, that's an excellent answer. You hit the nail on the head of exactly what I've thought through my role as an artist over the course of the last 5-10 years, however many, I see culture kind of taking this more narcissistic, ego-based kind of trend of, look at me and my stuff is cool, and, put a portfolio out there, put a bio out there, and like talk about how great your art is, versus like actually wanting to bring something to the world. And the three things that you brought up in terms of what you should be bringing into your art are all things that resonate deeply with me. So yeah, I don't know if you want to follow up, maybe if you have good ideas on how to make that more accessible for us as artists, because it seems like right now it's really hard to do that kind of thing, but I'm deeply interested and passionate about it.
More
if you
to
don't
come.
follow it now, obviously that's a deep question. So thank you very much. That was
All right, thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm just wondering, I feel like I would love to have Alania say any questions or thoughts that you may have. Yeah, if you wanted to pose something to Forrest, or any thoughts on this general session.
Yeah, it was fun to be with you, and I just want to check, like, anything burning in you, Forrest?
No, I'm good. It was. I'm aware that you could ask questions that I would be reluctant to answer, so I'm glad for your patience with me.
Well, I thought a little bit more about what I've felt has gone like a little bit like a thread through today. Like, we have the big picture, but then we have this, like, what am I to do? Like, and how can I do it? And how can I do it well? And
that would be my question. That would be my question, sorry.
Yeah. So can I talk about the surrender now, Forrest?
Please, that would be excellent.
Okay. So you are here on your journey, and I would assume that people with this massive brain that you're all showing that you have, most of you have come through your individuation process to a point where you feel that you're somewhat whole, Like there's a lot of things that are integrated in you. You do know, like you have feminine sides and you have the masculine side, and you can play a bit like whether I want to play out my card of feminine or the masculine, or me, myself, or the community or whatever. And I just wanted to point to the curiosity at what happens with us as we develop our capacity to surrender. And surrender is not like saying, oh, I'm laying back and let just the world happen to me and I'm a victim. It's the opposite of that. Surrendered leadership is to learn how to surrender into your highest leadership of you. And to really become a very good leader of surrendering your leadership into the connection, what Forrest talks about, like really know thyself, like in a connection with another person. I could say like, oh, Forrest, you're so beautiful, but there could be a deeper truth in me that I could surrender to. And I could say, Forrest, I really like the way you speak. And, you know, I could be really messed up in my head by his speaking. So there could be a deeper truth saying like, really, I feel heart connection with you, Forrest. And that might be me surrendering to deeper and deeper truth in me, into connection with another human being. And it's the same thing as we talked about earlier, like how can I see the void? How can I see what is needed in this world? It's like, where has your eyes been all your life? What are you looking at? What is intriguing you? And also there, I'm sure you've been into groups and then suddenly someone's saying, oh, I feel there's a sexual energy in this room, you know, completely not mine, okay? This is the collective. Of course, it's yours, but it's also collective. We can surrender into the collective. But then we need to get into a higher surrender. And that I'm sure you've seen as well, some people doing something that is out of this world, where you know that they could never have programmed their minds or had any way of planning. And this is what I would call like divine surrender, where my ego gets to the side and I'm actually moving with universe into action. And this is what I felt when Drew was talking. Like in communities like this, you will be on different levels of this kind of surrender and this kind of contributing. But I think we're all longing for the next level, which is where the collective divine comes together, where we're no egos, but where we have our egos as human beings, that we should be doing that. But our longing is to become one. And if we talk about all the things and subjects you've had into today, I would be curious about where are you? What is occupying you? And you know, that is yours to do. That is yours to bring. So many beautiful questions, but I would have exactly the same questions to all back of you that had a question. I do believe you have also an answer that is of importance to this world on the question you're asking. Thank you for having me with you here. Thank you, Forrest.
That was beautifully put. Thank you.
Forrest, do you have any final thoughts?
Looking forward to the next time. I'm feeling I like the balance, and this is good. I'm hoping that people are finding value in this, and I'm ready to continue.
Awesome. Yeah, thank Alanya for being here, Forrest as well, and for everybody and your great questions. Yeah, this is just week 2 out of 4, and hopefully there'll be more to come. Yeah, I want to end off with 2 things. One is just some upcoming sessions on the STOA, and then, yeah, one potential one, if it makes sense for us to show our thanks either through the chat or through voice at the end. We'll see. So yeah, upcoming sessions, just scrolling up here. First, there's one later today by Tyson. Tyson, if you want to unmute and talk about it.
Sure, thanks, Phil. That event is actually Sundays. So There's 2 left, actually. The event's called Flowing with Unknowingness. We practice freestyle rap and freestyle spoken word as a psychotech, a life practice for deepening our relationship with uncertainty and the unknown through our voice. And it turns out it's an excellent practice for building community, getting to know one another, and playing together. So there are actually just 2 sessions left here at the STOA before we bring in a new event for the new year. So if you've been meaning to attend and haven't yet, I would just warmly encourage you to check it out. One of the final 2 Sundays of the year. And I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much, Forrest, for joining us again, and look forward to the next couple sessions. Peace, everybody.
All right. I also got something from Peter in terms of Brett Cooper is coming in tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, talking about Stoic provocations, anti-intellectuals. So you can sign up at thestoa.ca for that. Yeah, so we're coming into the end of the session. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to leave any nice comments in the chat. And I'm curious, we all exercised our voice earlier on. I would love for people to potentially go on mute and show thanks as a group as well, very quickly. We'll see how it works. When we go.
Thank you, Forrest.
Thank you.
Forrest.
Thank you,
Forrest.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lonnie.
Obrigado.